Welcome to the Mrs. R Relevant Daily Draft Podcast. This episode is going to talk about the players in the upcoming 2025 NFL Draft that are playing in the Illinois at Oregon game this Saturday. This episode is sponsored by NFLDraftFanatics.com. So let's go ahead and use the NFL Draft Fanatics player list and focus at the beginning on Illinois. So Illinois has 4 likely draftable players, and I want to focus on the 2 in the middle initially. Pat Bryant, wide receiver from Illinois, and Zakhari Franklin, wide receiver from Illinois. So we're actually going to be doing a scouting report on Pat Bryant later on this Friday. So definitely want to give a shout out, and we'll talk about that more as the podcast winds down. But Illinois has 2 wide receivers that are likely going to get drafted. And if you remember, Illinois also had a wide receiver get drafted last year, and he's either on the Detroit Lions practice squad or he's their wide receiver 5 on their roster. And I believe that was Isaiah Johnston. I remember also seeing him at the Senior Bowl. So Illinois quietly has some draftable wide receiver pedigree in recent history. They also have edge Gabe Jacas, as well as offensive tackle J.C. Davis. And they are lining up against Oregon. And if we look at the Oregon player list, the list is a little bit longer. But we would definitely want to point out 2 players specifically on Oregon right at the top, Ajani Cornelius and Josh Conerly. And I want to point this out for at least 2 different reasons. This is not the greatest offensive tackle draft class. So specifically, what makes it not great? The 2 tackles that tend to be highest on most boards, a lot of NFL scouts say those guys are guards. And if your team needs an offensive tackle, there may not be the top 10, top 15 offensive tackle that you see in most draft classes, like the Joe Alts of the world or the J.C. Lathams of the world. Now, granted, last year was a unique offensive tackle class. It was really deep. This year is making up for the depth last year by just not having some of the top-end talent. So look at Conerly and look at Cornelius in this matchup. And remember that Gabe Jacas, edge from Illinois, would be matched up against these 2 tackles. So it'll definitely give us a good barometer on Gabe Jacas because he's going to be playing against NFL-level offensive tackles on Oregon in Conerly and Cornelius. Conerly right now, for me, is in somewhere between 25 and 45. And he's closer to 25 than he is 45. But he's in that late first, early second round area. Cornelius, I have a little bit lower. I believe he's in the 70s. So that would be like a late second, early third round grade for him. But both players, in my opinion, can move up considerably for several reasons. Josh Simmons, who was an offensive tackle that I had rated higher than Conerly, is now hurt. Okay? So again, if an NFL team needs a starting tackle in 2025, are you going to take a player that was injured or are you going to take a player that's still playing? I definitely think some of the injuries to the top prospects this year is going to be flipping the draft board upside down. And granted, right now it's October. The draft is in April. We have 5 or 6 months. So something to pay attention to. Jordan Birch, defensive lineman from Oregon, and Derek Harmon, defensive lineman from Oregon. You're seeing 2 top 100 defensive linemen in the 2 of them. So I have Derek Harmon inside my top 100. Jordan James would be another player to pay attention to. Running back from Oregon, followed also by Evan Stewart and Tez Johnson. So Tez Johnson and Evan Stewart, again, I have them in the top 100. I would definitely be paying attention to them and asking yourself, are either of them one of the 10 best wide receivers in the class? Okay. Tez Johnson is going to be more of a shifty slot wide receiver. That's not everybody's cup of tea at wide receiver. But those players, Xavier Worthy, Calvin Austin, those guys still get drafted, and they get drafted relatively high. I think Calvin Austin was a 4th-round pick. Xavier Worthy was a 1st-round pick last year. And there's plenty of players that are between them, the Jalen McMillans of the world, et cetera, where they're not the biggest wide receiver, but they still get drafted in the top 100 or the top 130. So Tez Johnson, Evan Stewart, I would look at them. Jordan James, the running back from Oregon, I would look at him as well. And that, for the most part, those are the players I wanted to give a shout out to. This is the Mrs. R Relevant Daily Draft Podcast. This channel has daily draft content on it. Right now, we discuss the matchups of the college football season. We still have about half of the college football games left to be played. We are also about to start a scouting report series. And as I mentioned, when we were looking at the Illinois wide receivers, this Friday, we are doing a wide receiver cornerback episode. So we're going to be covering, I believe it's 8 wide receivers and 6 corners, 14 total players. We'll be doing that in about 60 minutes, maybe 75. When we did something similar last weekend, there were a lot of questions that came in on the chat. So it's a very dynamic discussion. But I know that Pat Bryant is one of the wide receivers that we are going to highlight in this week's episode. We are not just doing the top wide receivers. The 8 wide receivers that were picked, we have 2 that are in the top 100. And then we have guys that are anywhere from, let's say, 101 to 300 on the draft board. We've got some HBCU players sprinkled in. And we're just trying to show scouting reports on a group of players. We're not trying to say that these are only the top guys. We're just trying to say, here are guys as the season ends, that when the Senior Bowl rolls around, we've given you preliminary scouting reports on a lot of the players that are in the Senior Bowl. So that episode is Friday. It'll either be 7 or 8 p.m. Eastern as we straighten out the availability of the 2 other people who are going to go through that discussion with me. But hopefully you can watch and view that. The best way to be notified of those is to follow the YouTube channel, as well as follow us on Twitter at NFL Draft Fanatic. There is no I in Fanatic on our Twitter. Excuse me. This episode is sponsored by NFLDraftFanatics.com. It is the only interactive mock draft simulator. And what that means is fans, when they do a mock draft, will modify the player boards of the team that they drafted for. So if somebody else were to come in and do a mock draft for a different team, the players the prior user selected may show up as the players that team mock drafted. So it makes for a much more dynamic and random mock draft experience because the player boards on the simulator are moving with every mock draft that fans do. So feel free to check that out. If you have any questions, please find us on YouTube, find us on Twitter. On behalf of NFLDraftFanatics.com and the Mrs. R Relevant Daily Draft Podcast, my name is Jim. Thank you very much for watching. And remember, every day can be your draft day if you have the right attitude. Thank you very much and have a great day.